another installment of Storytime with Chris. Hey, how we doing? I'm back. I was gone for a hot minute. I had a lot of stuff fall into my lap. Plus, work has been a bit busy, so hi. Welcome back, lovelies. How we doing? Hi. Now, as I always say, you don't have to watch these videos when they go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max, relax, and chillaxing time. In between time, mean time, scheme time, study time, break time, CP time, anytime that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. Hi. Welcome back. Now, got my buddy Archimedes here. He says hello. It is a very snowy day here in Yellow Springs. We had a bit of a blizzard, and we're supposed to get 4 inches of snow today. So I don't know what that's going to mean for tomorrow, but hopefully I'll be able to get to the store at some point today. But I hope everybody is at home, warm, safe, and comfortable. Other than that, I owe you 2 chapters today. I missed last week, and I do owe you more, which I will be reading 2 more chapters on Wednesday. And I need to read 2 chapters for The Grim Grotto, a series of unfortunate events, book 11, tomorrow. So thank you all so much for your patience. Thank you for your support. This year in March will mark 5 years of Storytime with Chris. I know that's crazy, right? 5 years. It's been 5 years. I started this during the pandemic. A very dear friend of mine who I used to work with, who unfortunately no longer works at the Mills Park Hotel because she's moved and has moved on to better and greener pastures. But it all started with one book, The Velveteen Rabbit. And I think that's what I'm going to do, is go back to that story. The story that began all of this. But we'll get to that bridge when we cross it, which is March 27th. Would be the date in which Storytime with Chris started. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our reading and return back into Oversea and Understone. Let's see what goes on with this ever-evolving mystery. So, last time we were here, Simon, Barney, and Jane had discussed with Great Uncle Mary that they had found this map, and that this map is actually a treasure map leading to a very sacred treasure. One of the weapons against the dark. So we're going to go ahead and sit back, relax, and get into it. Ugh. All right. Chapter 7. Well, I think it's underneath the Grey House. Yes. Look at how the burglars tried to take up the floor. But they were looking for the map. They were looking for the map, not the Grail. No, they weren't. Remember what Great Uncle Mary said. They didn't know what they were looking for, nor did he. It might have been a clue to it, like the map, or might even have been the thing itself. Well, the clue was there. Why shouldn't the thing itself be there as well? But look, idiot, Simon said, unrolling the map. The Grey House isn't marked. There isn't even a blotch. It just wasn't there then. Remember, our Cornishmen lived 900 years ago. Oh. They were sitting on the grass halfway up to Kamar Head, at the side of one of the rough-trodden tracks which ran zigzagging up its slope. Uncle Mary had left them on their own. A day's grace to find the first clue, he said. While I draw off the hounds, just one piece of advice. Don't start till the afternoon. Spend the morning on the beach or something, then you'll be sure the hounds are gone. He had gone out fishing for the day with Father, who was intent on trying a part of the sea off a headland a mile down the coast. And sure enough, as their small boat puttered out of the harbor with Father at the tiller and Great Uncle Mary towering stiff-backed in the bows, the yacht Lady Mary, gleaming white in the sun, had within minutes moved silently out after them, her engine purring faintly over the quiet morning sun. Watching from the house, they had seen her sails gradually unfurl and billow as they came into the bay. She took a wide course out to sea, but one from which Great Uncle Mary and Father would always be just in sight. Up on the headland now, the afternoon sun prickled their bare legs, and there was a small breeze. "Oh dear," Jane said despondently, edging a blade of grass from its sheath and nibbling it. "This is hopeless. We just don't know where to start. Perhaps we should just go back to where we were yesterday." "But we know what things look like from there." "Well, so what? Which things?" "Well, the headland, and the sea, and the sun, and those stones up on the top there." Barney gestured vaguely above their heads, up the slope. "I think they've got something to do with it. The Cornishmen must have been able to see them. Gummery says they're 3,000 years old, and so they'd have been almost as ancient-looking 900 years ago as they are now." "You can certainly see them clear from the other side," Simon sat up, interested. "But there's such a long way across," Jane pointed out. "I mean, the first clue might be that you just have to take 10 paces to your left, or something. It's always in stories about buried treasure, but to get to the standing stones up here from over there, you'd have to take thousands of paces right across the harbor. It just doesn't make any sense." My apologies, throat is a little dry. "It doesn't have to be like that," Simon said. "It could be the thing that compass bearings again. You know, perhaps we have to get something in line with something else to lead us on to the third thing." Barney closed his eyes and screwed up his face, tried to bring back a picture of the scene they had gazed at so hard the evening before. "Do you remember when the sun set yesterday?" he said slowly. "The biggest standing stone was right bang in line with the sun from where we were. I remember because you could only see it if you didn't look straight at it, if you see what I mean." Simon looked closely at the manuscript. Again, excitement beginning to dawn on his face. "Do you know, I think you've got something there. This round thing. Perhaps it's supposed to be the sun. I mean, if he knew the map wouldn't be found for years and years and years, he'd have to use signs like the sun. That wouldn't be likely to change." "Come on then, let's go further up and look." Jane jumped eagerly to her feet, and then suddenly she froze, stock still. "Simon, quick," she said quietly in a strained, tight voice. "Put the map away." "Hide it." Simon frowned. "What on earth? Quickly! It's Miss Withers. She's coming up the path and someone else is with her. They'll be right on top of us in a minute." Simon hastily rolled up the manuscript and stuffed it into his rucksack. "Who is with her?" he hissed. "I can't see." "Yes, I can." Jane turned away quickly as if it hurt her to look and sat down again. She was very flushed. "It's that boy, the one who knocked me over. I knew he was mixed up in all this somehow." They heard voices then, coming nearer up the slope. Miss Withers' clear tones floated up to them. "I don't care, Bill. We have to check on everything. He may already have..." Then she was on them, silhouetted against the skyline. As she saw the three children sitting looking expressionlessly up at her. The boy stopped too, glowering. For a moment Miss Withers stood with her mouth slightly open, taken aback. Then she pulled herself together and flashed a smile at them. "Well," she said pleasantly, coming forward, "what a nice surprise. All the Drew family at once. I hope you boys don't feel tired after all that sea air we gave you the other day." "Not a bit, thank you," Barney said in his clearest, most public voice. "It's a marvelous boat," Simon, equally distant and polite. "What are you all doing up here?" Miss Withers inquired innocently. She was wearing slacks with a sleeveless white blouse that made her arms look very brown, and her dark hair was tumbled by the breeze. She looked very attractive and healthy. She glanced at Jane expectantly. Jane gulped. "We were just looking at the sea. We saw your boat go out this morning." "We thought you'd be on board her," Simon added without thinking. A flicker of wariness crossed Polly Withers' face. She said easily, "Ah, I'm not the best of sailors, as I probably told you." Simon looked deliberately down at the sea. It lay as flat and unrippled as a pond. Miss Withers said, following his, "Oh, I'll blow up later. You mark my words." "Oh?" Simon said. His face was expressionless still, but there was the faintest note of insolent disbelief in his tone. For the first time, Miss Withers' smile faded slightly. Before she could say anything, the boy with her spoke. "Miss Polly be allus right about the sea," he said gruffly, glaring at Simon. "She do know more than all the old men down there together." He jerked his head contemptuously down at the harbor. "Oh, I haven't introduced you," Miss Withers said brightly. "Do forgive me, Jane, Simon, Barnabas. This is Bill, our right-hand man. Without him, the Lady Mary couldn't do a thing." The boy flushed darkly and looked down at his grubby sneakers. After a quick glance up at her, Jane thought pityingly, He thinks she's wonderful. We've met before, Simon said shortly. Barney said, how's your bicycle? No better for your asking, the boy snapped. Watch your manners, Bill. Through the sweet smile, Mrs. Withers' voice was cold and tight as a steel wire. That's not the way we speak to our friends. Bill looked at her in sullen reproach, jerked forward, and went on up the path without a word. Oh, dear, Miss Withers sighed. Now I've hurt his feelings. These village people are so touchy. She made a charming conspiratorial little grimace at them. I suppose I better go check after him. She turned to follow the boy and then swung around again. Words shot out like a flick of lightning. Have you found a map? For a moment of roaring silence that seemed like an hour, they stared at her, and then Barney, driven by pure naked alarm, took refuge in gabbling nonsense. Did you say a map, Miss Withers? Or was it a gap? We did find a gap in the hedge down there. That was how we got through up to the headland. But we haven't got a map. At least I haven't. I don't know about Simon and Jane. Don't you know your way up the hill? Miss Withers, staring fixedly at them, relaxed in friendliness again. Yes, that's right, Barnabas. A map. I don't know my way about it all well, and as a matter of fact, and I couldn't find a map anywhere in the shops this morning. There's one little footpath I'm looking for just over the other side, and Bill isn't very much help. I believe Great Uncle Mary has a map, Jane said vaguely. She was watching closely from the corner of her eye, but not a muscle moved in Miss Withers' face. You haven't met our great uncle, have you, Miss Withers? He's gone out fishing with Father today. What a pity. I'm awfully sorry we can't help. I do hope you find your way, Simon said kindly. Well, I expect I shall, Miss Withers said. She flashed her bright smile at them and turned away up the path, raising her hand. Hi, all of you. They watched in silence until she disappeared over the line where the slope met the sky. Then Barney flung himself face down on the ground and rolled over and over, letting out a long, relieved breath. Whee! How awful! When she suddenly said, he buried his face in the grass. Do you think she realizes? Jane said anxiously to Simon. Did we give it away? I don't know, Simon gazed thoughtfully up the quiet green slope. There was no sign that now of Miss Withers or of anything except one faraway grazing sheep. I don't think so. I mean, we must have all looked pretty silly when she asked about a map. I know you did. So did you, like a fish. All right. Well, we could perfectly well have looked surprised anyway. Her saying it out of the blue like that. I don't think she'd be able to tell if we were looking guilty or just startled. I expect, he added, gaining confidence as he went on, she believes we really did think she just wanted an ordinary map to find our way. Perhaps that's all she did want. No fear, Barney said, emerging from the grass. She was testing us out, all right. Otherwise, why did she say found? Have you found a map? Any normal person would have said, I say, have you got a map? He's quite right. Simon stood up, rubbing the dust from his legs. Great Uncle Mary was right, too. They weren't taking chances. Miss Withers was surprised to see us. You could tell, but it wasn't 5 seconds before she was having a go about the map. It was nasty altogether. Jane said, wriggling her shoulders as if she was shaking off the memory. She looked up the slope. How can we go up there now? We shan't be able to tell if she and that horrible boy are hidden away somewhere, watching everything we do. Well, it's no good letting that stop us, Simon stuck out his chin. If we think about being watched, we should never do anything. So as long as we behave normally, as if we were just wandering about, it ought to be all right. He picked up his rucksack. Come on. The side of Kamar Head was steeper than the opposite headland had been, and for a long time as they toiled up the zigzag path, they saw blazing nothing above them but the line of the slope against the sky with the sun blazing down into their eyes. The head of the headland, rocky and gray, stretched out far beyond them into the sea, and sweeping towards it, the land looked immensely solid, as if it were all rock and the soil above it no more than a skin. And then they were at the top of the slope, where the grass grew short in a great dry green sweep, and they could see the standing stones. As they drew nearer, the stones seemed to grow, pointing slightly to the sky like past tombstones set on end. Excuse me. Stone, Simon said, is the biggest understatement I've ever heard. Like calling Nelson's column a stick. Excuse me. He stood considering the giant granite pillars rising above him. There were 4 of them, one much higher than the rest, with the other 3 grouped irregularly rounded. Perhaps the Grail's buried underneath one of those, Barney said tentatively. It can't be. They're too old. Anyway, I think you're wrong about it being buried.
Oh, come on, it must be, Jane said. How else could anything stay hidden all the time?
I remember that bit in the manuscript, said Barney. Over sea and under stone. Simon rubbed his ear, still dissatisfied. We aren't over the sea here. The sea's miles away. We're, well, all right, not miles, but I bet it's 400 yards to the end of the headland.
Well, we're still above the sea, aren't we?
I'm sure that's what he meant. Over sea, under stone. I wonder. Anyway, we're trying to go too fast. Step by step, Gummery said. We ought to stick to the step we're on. Simon looked at the sun, gradually sinking over the coast where cliff after cliff curved into the mist beyond Kamar Head. Have a look at the stones. The sun will be as low as it was yesterday soon.
They look so different when you're close.
Jane wandered around the weather-beaten gray pillars of rock.
We want to know which one it was that looked in line with the sun from the other side, isn't that it? But how do we find that out from here?
It was the biggest one, Barney said. It stood up higher than the rest. The sun glowed deep towards the horizon, casting an orange-gold warmth over their faces. Look at the shadows, Simon said suddenly. His shadow on the ground before him moved along our dappled edge by the grass as he pointed. That's the way we can do it from this side, backwards. If one stone was directly between us and the sun yesterday, that means that from here its shadow would be pointing directly to where we were standing there, towards the rock Gummery was standing against. Look, you could just see it from there. Following his arm, they saw the one chunky rock on the opposite headland, a small, faraway bump on its skyline, lit bright by the gold of the setting sun. It was higher than the standing stones on Kamar Head, and further out towards the sea, but it was undoubtedly the spot where they had stood the day before. Jane gazed at Simon in open and unusual admiration. He flushed slightly and became very brisk. Come on, Barney, quick before the sun goes. Which stone did you think it was?
Well, it was the biggest, so it must have been this one.
Barney moved a yard or two downhill to the tallest stone. He crossed to its other side, facing the harbor, and crouched down in the shadow, peering at the lone stone across the bay. He frowned doubtfully. Simon and Jane moved to one side of him, waiting impatiently. Barney, his frown deepening, suddenly lay down on his stomach in the grass, so that he was lying along the line of the pointing shadow and looked straight ahead. Am I lying straight? He said, rather muffled. Yes, dead straight. Is it the right one? Barney scrambled to his feet, looking doleful. No, that shadow doesn't point exactly at the rock. You can see the rock clearly enough, but you have to shift your eyes slightly to be looking straight ahead, and that's cheating. But you said it was the tallest stone you saw.
I still say it was. I don't see how it could have been, Jane said petulantly with disappointment.
Simon was thinking hard, holding the rucksack swinging by its strap and banging it absently against his leg. He turned and looked back at the three other stones, standing black now and gold-rimmed against the blaze of the sun. Then he yelped, dropped the rucksack, and rushed towards the furthest stone. Scrabbling down at Barney had done to lie in its shadow. Holding its breath, he dropped his chin to the grass and shut his eyes. Move your top half a bit to the left.
You're not straight, Jane said,
close beside him, beginning to understand. Simon shifted a few inches, raised himself on his elbows. That right?
Okay.
Simon crossed his fingers and opened his eyes. Straight in front of him, over the blades of grass, right in the middle of his line of vision, the bright sunlit rock on the opposite headland was staring him in the face. This is the one, he rushed in a coarsely subdued voice. Barney rushed across and dropped down beside him. Let me. He elbowed Simon out of the way and squinted across the harbor at the rock. You're right, he said rather reluctantly. But it was the biggest stone that I saw. I know it was. That's right, said Jane. What do you mean, that's right?
Look at the way the stones are put up. Look at the way the ground slopes. This is the top of the headland, but it isn't flat, and the big stone is lower down than the others. The one you're next to now is higher up the hill, even though it's not the tallest. So where you saw its outline against the sky yesterday, it looked as if it were the tallest.
Gosh, Barney said. I never thought of that. Simon said loftily, I thought you might get there in the end.
It was really clever of you, Jane said. If you hadn't been so quick, we might never have realized. The shadows will be gone soon. She pointed down at the grass. The blaze of the sun was sinking over the far horizon behind them, and the shadow creeping up over the ground, swallowing up the long shadows of the stones. But across the harbor, the rock on the other headland, higher up and longer exposed to the sun, still shone bright like a beacon. Hold on 1 second, y'all. Need to get some tissue. Hold on. 1 second. All right. It's a bit chilly, do. Pardon him, what? Excuse me, pardon me. All right. I'm back. Okay. Alrighty. Making sure we still got a winter storm warning. Goodness. There we go. Barney whooped with delight. "We've got it! We've got it!" He thwacked one hand across against the hard, warm rock of the standing stone and whirled round in a circle. "We're on the first step! Isn't it fabulous?" "Only the first step, though," Simon said, but pleasure was bubbling within him as well. They all three felt suddenly enormously energetic. "But we know where to look for the next clue now. We go from there." Barney ran his head over the surface of the standing stone again. "From this one. But where?" Simon said, determined to be realistic. "And how?" "We just have to look at the map again. It's bound to tell us. I mean, really, the first clue was marked plain as plain. How to get there from the other headland over to the stone here. If only we'd known how to understand it." Barney ran across to where Simon had dropped his rucksack, flipped the straps open, and fumbled inside, bringing out the grubby brown roll of the manuscript from its case. "Look," he said, sitting down with a bump and spreading it out on the grass before him. "Here's where the stone's marked." "Bring it further up," Simon said, looking over his shoulder. "The sun's still in the grass a bit higher up, and you need the brightest light, and you can get to look at it. Anyway, it'll be warmer." Barney clambered obligingly up the slope, past the massive gray foot of the last and tallest standing stone, to where the grass was still a bright green in the last golden light of the sun. Simon and Jane followed him, standing on either side so that their own shadows should not darken the faint, indistinct scrawl on the curling parchment. They bent down, staring at the crude, quick outline that was the Cornishman's picture made 900 years before of the standing stones. Miss Withers' voice said behind them, "So you have found a map after all." A great
wave of horror enveloped Barney, and he froze hunched over the manuscript. Simon and Jade wheeled around in alarm. Miss Withers stood close behind them, higher up the slope. Her outline was dark and menacing against the sunset sky, and they could not see her face. The boy Bill appeared silently behind her and stood at her elbow. The sight of them both poised there filled Jane with panic, and she suddenly felt frightened at the silence and emptiness of the headland. Barney's finger unconsciously curled into his palm, and the edge of the manuscript release sprang back into a closed roll. The faint crackle of its movement sounded like a gunshot in the silence.
"Oh, don't put it away," Miss Withers said clearly. "I want to have a look."
She took a step forward, stretching out her hand, and in a terror, the flat, expressionless voice, Jane cried out suddenly, "Simon!" As the dark figure loomed swiftly towards him from the hill, Simon felt himself wake up. Quicker than his own thought, he swung round, dipped swiftly, and snatched up the manuscript from Barney's knee, and then he was gone, half slithering, half running down the slanting side of Kamar Head towards the village. "Bill, quickly!" Miss Withers snapped. The big, silent figure beside her shot into sudden life, tearing down the hill at Simon's heels. But he was too clumsy for his speed, and in mid-flight on the edge of the slope, he stumbled and half fell. He recovered himself almost at once, but not before Simon, running and slipping straight down over the grass and the zigzagging paths, had gained 30 yards lead.
"He won't catch him," Jane said, her voice wavering with excitement, feeling a broad smile of relief spreading over her stiff cheeks.
"Run it, Simon!" Barney shrilled down the hill, scrambling to his feet. Miss Withers came down towards them, and they drew back from the sight of her face, twisted by rage, into something frightening and unfamiliar, no longer attractive, no longer even young. She snarled at them. "You stupid children, tampering with things you don't understand." She swung away from them and made off down the slope in the same direction that Simon had taken. In a long, quick stride, they watched her angry, erect, back across and reacross the slope on the zigzag path until she disappeared over the edge of the headland.
"Come on," Barney said. "We've got to find Gummery. Simon's going to need help."
The dry grass was like polished wood under Simon's feet, giving no grip as he slipped and slithered down the hillside, now on his feet, now flat on his back and elbows, holding one arm up always to keep the manuscript from damage. Behind him, he heard the noise of the boy from the village slipping and stumbling more heavily, his breath rasping in his throat, and an occasional gasping curse as he lost his footing and fell. Facing outwards across the harbor as he ran down, Simon felt that he could almost jump straight out into the sea. The slope seemed much steeper than when they had climbed up the path, dropping below him in an endless green curve. His heart was thumping wildly, and he was too intent on getting away to imagine what might happen if the boy had caught up with him. But gradually, minute by minute, the panic at the pit of his stomach was disappearing. Everything depended on him now, to keep the manuscript safe and get away. He was almost enjoying himself. This was something that he could understand. It was like a race or a fight at school, himself against the boy Bill, and he wanted to win. Panting, he glanced over his shoulder. The boy seemed to be gaining on him a little. Simon flung himself down the rest of the slope, sliding and bumping on his back, alarmingly fast, and now and again coming to his feet for a couple of staggering steps. And then suddenly he was at the bottom of the slope, stumbling and gulping for breath, with a brief glance up at the pursuing Bill, who yelled and glared at him as he saw him looking around. Simon was off and away over the field, running like a hare and feeling confidence surge stronger as he ran, but he could not lose the boy behind him, stronger and bigger and longer-legged. The village boy pounded after him with grim determination and striding more heavily but never losing ground. Simon made for a stile hedge at the far side of the field and leapt over, gripped the shaking wooden bar at its top with one hand. He came out at the other side into a quiet lane, pitted with deep, dry ruts, hard as rock, lined with trees, arching overhead in a thick-leaved roof, with the sunlight quite gone now, and it was half dark under the branches, and both ends of the lanes vanished within a few yards into impenetrable shadow. Simon looked wildly up and down, clutching the manuscript and feeling the sweet damp in the palms of his hands. Which way would lead him to the Grey House? He could no longer hear the sea. Making a blind choice, he turned right and ran up the lane. Behind him, he heard the clatter of the boy's boots climbing over the stile. He The lane seemed never-ending as he ran, dodging light-footed from side to side to avoid the ruts. Round every bend there stretched another, curving on in a gloomy tunnel of branches and begs, with no break anywhere into a gate or another field. They could hear the beat of the boy's feet behind him on the hard, dry mud of the lane. The boy shouted nothing now, but pounded along in a grim silence. Simon felt a thread of panic creep back into his mind, and he ran more wildly, longing to get out of the cavernous lane and into the open air. Then facing him around the next bend, he saw the sky, bright after the gloom, and within minutes he was out again, running on a paved road past quiet walls and trees. Again he turned automatically without time to think where he was going, and the rubber soles of his sneakers pattered softly along the deserted road. It's a chase. The boy's footsteps rang more loudly behind him now, over the quiet evening twitter of birds hidden in the trees. The sound of the feet, so much noisier than his own, gave Simon the beginnings of an idea, and when at last the road branched off, he put out a desperate burst of speed and ran down the side, turning. The wall ended at two battered gate posts, through which he glimpsed an overgrown drive. Further down the road he caught sight of the rising tower of Thruisic Church, and his heart sank as he realized how far he was from home. The boy Bill had not turned the corner yet. Simon could hear his steps gradually growing louder from the main road. Quickly he slipped inside the deserted gateway of the long drive and wriggled into the bushes, which grew in an unruly tangle beside the gatepost. He jumped with pain as thorns and sharp twigs stuck into him from all sides, but he crouched quite still behind the leaves, trying to quiet his gasping breaths, certain that the pounding of his heart might be audible all up and down the road. The idea worked. He saw Bill, disheveled and scarlet, pause at the end of the road, peering up and down. He looked puzzled and angry, listening with his head cocked from the side of feet. Then he turned and walked slowly towards Simon's hiding place down the side road, glancing back uncertainly over his shoulder. Simon held his breath and crouched further back into the bushes. Unexpectedly, he heard a noise from behind him, turned his head sharply, wincing as a fat purple fuchsia blossom bobbed into his eye. He listened. In a moment he recognized the sound of feet crunching on gravel, coming towards the road down the drive. The gasp of light through the branches darkened for an instant as the figure of a man paused very close to him, walking down the drive and out through the gateway. Simon saw that he was very tall and had dark hair, but he could not see his face. The figure wandered idly out into the road. Simon saw now that he was dressed all in black, long, thin black legs like a heron, and a black silk jacket with the light glinting silvery over his shoulders. The boy Bill's sullen face brightened as he caught sight of the man, and he ran forward to meet him in the middle of the road. They stood talking, but out of earshot, so that Simon could hear their voices as an indistinct low blur. Bill was waving his hands and pointing back behind him to the road and then down the drive. Simon saw the dark man shake his head. And still, he could not see his face. Then they both turned back towards the drive and began to walk in his direction. Bill still talking eagerly. Simon shrank nervously back into his hiding place, feeling suddenly more frightened than he had done since the chase began. This was no stranger to Bill. The boy was smiling. The man was somehow he had recognized with relief. Someone else on the enemy's side. He could see nothing but the leaves before his face and did not dare move forward to peer through a gap, but the footsteps ringing on the wind passed outside the wall and on up the road. Simon heard the murmur of voices but could distinguish nothing except one phrase when the village boy raised his voice. "Got to gettin'," she said. "'Tis surely the right one, and now I've lost me," thought Simon with a grin. His terror faded as the footsteps died away, and he began to feel triumphant at having outwitted the bigger boy. He glanced down at the manuscript in his hand and gave it a spiritual squeeze. There was silence again now, and he could hear nothing but the song of the birds in the approaching dusk. He wondered how late it was. The chase seemed to have lasted for a week. The muscles of his legs began to nag protestingly at their long, cramped stillness. But still he waited, straining his ears for any sound showing that the man and the boy were still near. At last he decided that this must have gone out of sight down the road. Clutching the manuscript firmly, he parted the bushes before his face with one hand and stepped out into the drive. No one was there. Nothing moved. Simon tiptoed gingerly across the gravel and peered up and down around the gatepost. He could see no one, and with growing cheerfulness he crossed from the gateway to make his way back to the road from which he had come. It was not until he had
paces out in the open that he saw the boy Bill and the dark man standing together beside the wall 50 yards ahead. In clear view, Simon gasped and felt his stomach twist with panic. For a moment he stood there, uncertain whether to bolt back to the shelter of the drive before they could see him. But as he hesitated, mesmerized, Bill turned his head, shouted, and began to run, and the man with him, realizing, turned to follow. Simon swung round and dashed for the main road. The silence all around seemed subtly as menacing as the leaf-roof lane had been. He ached for the safety of crowds and people and cars, so that he would at least lose the awful sensation of being alone, with feet pounding after him in implacable pursuit. Down the side road, round the corner, and along the wall of the churchyard. Faster, faster! Simon's heart sank as he ran. His legs were stiff after the cramped pause in the bushes, and his whole body was very tired. He knew that he would not be able to last very much longer. A car passed him, traveling fast in the opposite direction. Wild thoughts flickered through Simon's mind as he felt the road beating hard through his thin rubber shoes. He could shout and wave at a car, perhaps, or run for refuge into one of the little houses that were fringing the road as he neared the village. But the boy Bill had a man with him now, and the man could tell some story to any stranger Simon approached, and the stranger would probably believe that instead. "Stop!" a deep voice called behind him. Desperately, Simon tried to fling himself forward faster. Everything would have been over if they caught him. They would have the manuscript. They would have the whole secret. They would have nothing left to do. He would have broken the trust. He would have let Gummery down. His breath began to come in great painful gasps, and he staggered as he ran. There was a crossroads ahead. The fast, decisive footsteps behind him sounded louder and louder. Almost he heard his pursuers breathing in his ears. He heard the boy call on a note of triumph. "Quick! Now!" The voice was farther away than the footsteps. It must be the man who was behind him, almost at his heels, his feet thundering nearer and nearer. Simon's ears were singing with the fight for breath. The crossroads loomed ahead, but he could hardly see them. He heard, half-consciously, the noisy roar of a car engine very near, but he barely registered in his weary brain. There was a rattle and a squeal of brakes, and halfway across the crossroads, he almost collided with the rusting hood of a big car. Simon slithered to a halt and managed to dodge round it, aware only of the danger at his heels, and then, as if the darkening twilight sky were once more suddenly flooded with sunlight, he realized Great Uncle Mary was leaning from the window of the car. The car's engine revved up again with a thunderous roar. "The other side! Get in!" Great Uncle Mary yelled at Simon through the window. With relief, Simon stumbled around the back of the big estate car and wrenched at the handle of the door on the other side. He collapsed into the creaking seat and pulled the door shut as Great Uncle Mary let in the clutch and slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The car leapt forward, jerking around the corner, and then they were down the road and away. Shout out to Gummery coming in clutch. Okay, as the kids would say, but hold on real quick, because I want to make some tea. I'll be back. Kettle going?
down the street. Coming down the willow path. You've never seen a parakeet. Taking my time. Do a little thing and moving. Alright. Now that, kids, is what's called a narrow escape. Many a time I've run away from a bully growing up in elementary school and made it to the house. Just in the nick of time. Just in the nick of time. Oh, goodness. Oh, hush. That's just the kettle on the stove. It's getting heated up. There we go. Oh, see, kids? There are people out here right now trying to shovel their cars and trucks out. Gotta get to the store, which will be me after this. Alright. Chapter 8. But how did you know where to come? Simon said as Great Uncle Mary changed gear noisily at the foot of the hill up to the gray house. I didn't really. I was just driving around the village, hoping I should find you. Left as Jane and Barney came tumbling back into the house. Poor mites, they were in a dreadful state. They rushed into the drawing room and grabbed me bodily. Your parents were rather amused. Seemed to think we were playing some great private game. Great Uncle Mary smiled grimly. Gosh, it was lucky you chose that road to drive along, Simon said. I've never been so glad to see anybody in my life. Well, you must remember, I know through Isaac. When the children said they hadn't been able to find you on the path back to the house, I knew there was only one way you could have gone. You came out onto the Pintereth lane, didn't you? There was a lane, Simon said, all shut up by trees. I didn't really have time to see what it was called. Great Uncle Mary chuckled. No, I dare say not. Anyway, I gambled on your turning out that lane out to the main Trigani Road, which in fact you did. Good job you didn't go the other way. Why? Simon said, remembering the blind choice he had made in the lane, with the boys scrambling over the stile behind him. In the other direction, that lane is a dead end. It leads up to Pentrerith Farm, if you can call it a farm. It's been hopelessly neglected for years. Mrs. Polk's no-good brother lives there. Young Bill Hoover's father. So does the boy himself when he bothers to go home. Which, gather, isn't very often, but on the other, it wouldn't have been a very healthy place for you to run to. Golly, Simon felt cold at the thought. Well, never mind, you didn't anyway. Great Uncle Mary stopped the car with a final rattle and roar, heaved at the handbrake. Here, we are home. Safe home. Now you can run along in and clean yourself up before your mother sees you. There's some friend of hers come to dinner, luckily, so she'll be shut up in the drawing room. Out you get. I'll put the car away, and Simon, halfway out the door with the manuscript clutched to his breast, paused and looked back. He could only see Great Uncle Mary's face, his ruffled white hair turned to a dark tangle by the shadow, and light from a street lamp up the hill reflecting eerily back to make his eyes two glinting points in the dark. It was very well done, Great Uncle Mary said quietly. Simon said nothing but slammed the door, feeling suddenly more grown-up than he had ever been before. And when the car had coughed up the hill, he had forgotten all his weariness and crossed the road, holding his back very straight. Jane and Barney were at the door before he had one foot on the step. They hustled him inside and towards the stairs. Did he catch you? You still got it. Oh, well done. Oh, we thought you'd get all beaten up. This was Barney, wide-eyed and solemn. You didn't get hurt, did you? What happened? Jane ran her eyes critically over Simon like a doctor. I'm all right. There was a sudden bright streak of light in the hall as the drawing room door opened. Mother called over a murmur of voices from inside. Is that you, children? Yes, Jane called across the banisters. Supper's nearly ready. Don't be long. Come straight down when you've washed. All right, Mother. The door closed again. They're all talking like anything in there, Jane said to Simon. Mother and Father met some long-lost friend in the harbor, and it turns out she lives in Penzance. I think she pays too. She's staying to supper. She seems quite nice. Did he chase you for miles? Hundreds of miles, Simon said, he yawned. Hundreds and hundreds. And then Great Uncle Mary turned up just when I was going to get caught. We sent him out after you, Barney said eagerly. They went on up the stairs. We didn't send him, Jane said reprovingly. He went, like a rocket, as soon as he heard what had happened. Well,
Wouldn't have gone if we hadn't told him, and then Simon wouldn't have rescued. Barney was glowing with excitement. He would have given his ears to have been the hero of the chase. We didn't know which way you'd gone. We tailed Mrs. Withers for a bit, but she went down the headland and sat down on the grass at the bottom looking out at the sea. His voice rose to an incredulous squeak. So we rushed home and Great Uncle Mary was just back from fishing. We were jolly glad to see you getting out of the car, he added unexpectedly. Not half as glad as me, Simon yawned again and rubbed his forehead. I do feel mucky. Must have been when I had hid in those bushes. Come on, I can tell you while I wash. First, they were too busy eating to talk, and then towards the end of supper, too busy trying not to fall asleep. So all three children were grateful that Miss Hatherton was there. She was a small, bright, bouncy person, quite old, with cropped gray hair and twinkling eyes. She was a sculptress, a famous one. Great Uncle Mary told them afterwards, and had taught Mother when she was a student at art school. She was also seemed to have a passion for catching sharks, and at the supper table she alternated between enthusiastic discussions of art with Mother and fishing with Father. The children listened with interest, but were relieved when Mrs. Polk brought the coffee in, and Mother, who had not missed their yawns, sent them to bed. Nothing like Cornish air to send you to sleep, Miss Hatherton said cheerfully as they pushed back their chairs and said goodnight. If any of those fellows in your footsteps, she added to Mother, it'll be that one. She pointed disconcertingly at Barney. Barney blinked at her. What do you want to do when you grow up, young man? She asked him. I'm going to be a fisherman, Barney said promptly, with a big boat like the White Heather. Miss Hatherton roared with laughter. Oh, you tell me that in 10 years' time, she said, and I shall be very surprised. Good night. I'll buy your first picture. She's dotty, Barney said as they went upstairs. I don't want to be a painter. Never mind, Simon said. She's nice. Don't go, Jane. Come in our room for a minute. I think Gummery's coming up. He made a sort of face at me as I closed the door. They waited, and in a few moments Great Uncle Mary appeared in the doorway. I can't stay more than a minute, he said. I'm engaged in the beginnings of what promises to be a long and heated discussion with Miss Hatherton and your mother over the relative merits of Caravaggio and Salvator Rosa. Coo, said Barney. As you say, Barnabas, coo. I rather think I'm out of my class with those two. However... Gummery, we found it, Jane said eagerly. We found the second step. We've started properly now. It's one of the standing stones of Quemar Head. The boys did it between them, really, she added honestly. Come on, Simon, get the manuscript out. Simon got up and retrieved the telescope case, grubbier and more battered now than it had been, from the top of the wardrobe. They laid the scroll out on the bed and showed Great Uncle Mary the rock where it had all begun, and the small rough sketch of the sun, and how they had worked their way to the standing stone. But we can't tell which standing stone it is on the map, Simon said. Perhaps because they don't look the same here as they actually do on this headland. They all bent over the drawing that they could not help calling a map. Great Uncle Mary looked at it in silence. Gummery, Jane said tentatively, an idea that she had not quite grasped beginning to chase about her brain. Would he have done the whole thing on the same system, do you think? Whatever do you mean, Simon said, bouncing flat on his back on the bed. Well, you remember we were trying to work out the first bit, and I said that it ought to be the way all treasure maps start, 6 paces to the east or something. And you said no, it might have been done by getting one thing in line with another as a sort of pointer. Well, does that mean that you have to get everything in line with something else at every step? Are all the clues going to be the same kind of clue? You mean next we shall have to go standing something else in line with the standing stone? Great Uncle Mary was still gazing down at the map. It's possible. What makes you say so? That, Jane said. She pointed at the map. Everyone peered. I can't see anything, Barney said querulously. Look there, over the end of Quemar Head. But that's just another of those blotches, Simon said in disgust. How can that mean anything? Doesn't it remind you of anything? No, Simon said. He lay back and yawned. Great Uncle Mary looked from one another and smiled to himself. Oh, really, Jane said, exasperated. I know you've done jolly well today, and I know you're tired, but honestly... I'm listening, Barney said at her elbow. What about the blotch? It's not a blotch at all, Jane said. At least I don't think so. It's a bit smudged, but it's a circle, a properly drawn one, and I think it means something. It looks just like the other one, the one over the standing stones that turned out to be the setting sun. Simon propped himself up on his elbows and began to take an interest again. Jane went on thinking aloud. The way the first clue worked, we had to find the stone that was in line with the sun and the rock we're standing from. And then we had to go to the stone and check that it was the right one by the shadow. Well, perhaps now we have to do the same thing. But something that's in line with the stone, and then go to it and see if its shadow points back to the stone.
Great Uncle Mary said softly, "The signs that wax and wane but do not die."
Jane turned to him eagerly. That's it! That's what he said, isn't it? In the manuscript. There must be all sorts of clues in the writing as well as the drawing, only there are even more buried and we don't even know how to get at them.
"This shadow business," Simon said doubtfully, "couldn't it be simpler than the way she just said? Perhaps all we have to do is find out what the shadow of our standing stone points out."
But it points back at the place we started, Barney said. Perhaps we didn't use it as its first clue. His first clue was, look and see what's between you and the setting sun. The shadow was just our way of proving it.
Well, it doesn't have to be a shadow made by the setting sun this time.
That's where the blotch comes in, Jane said.
Barney said sleepily,
"Perhaps it's the rising sun. Only it can't be. It isn't in the right place."
"No," Simon said, "of course it isn't. It's just a blotch." Jane sputtered with impatience and glared at him.
"Oh, why does it have to be the sun at all?"
Hold on 1 second, because the kettle is about to boil over. Hold on. Be right back. Bing bang. Splish, splash, and chicken fast, round about Saturday night.
What is this feeling so sudden and new? I felt the moment I laid eyes on you. My pulse is rushing, my head is reeling. Well, my face is flushing. What is this feeling? Fervent as a flame. Does it have a name? Yes. Loathing. Unadulterated loathing. And my voice is not completely back yet, but that's okay. Ooh. Ow. Sorry, y'all. For your face, your voice, your clothing, let's just say I loathe it all. Every little trait, however small, makes my very flesh begin to crawl. I got my cup of tea. Remember, children, always blow on something that's super hot so you don't burn yourself. Great Uncle Mary was still sitting silent and statuesque on the edge of the bed. He said again lovingly to himself, "The signs that wax and wane but do not die." Simon gazed at him blankly. "Don't you see?" Jane almost howled at him. "It isn't the sun, it's the moon!"
Simon's face began to change like the sky on a windy day, different expressions chasing one another across it. He looked from Jane to the map to Great Uncle Mary. Gomery, he said accusingly, I believe you knew the whole time. Is she right? Great Uncle Mary stood up. The bed creaked as he rose, and his height seemed to fill the room. The light swinging from the ceiling behind his head cast his face into shadow, and brought back once more to all three of them that old sense of mystery. His great dark figure, with a mist of light faintly silver round his head, left them silent and awed. This is your quest, he said. You must find the way every time yourselves. I am the guardian, no more. I can take no part and give you no help beyond guarding you all the way. He turned slightly so that the light shone on his face, and then his face was ordinary again. I imagine you'll need some guarding on this next stage, too. You know what it is now, don't you? Simon said slowly. We'll have to find which way the shadow of the Standing Stone points at night. Under the moon. Barney said, for a fact, the full moon. The full moon? James Blodge, he drew it round, not crescent shape, so it must mean the full moon. What is it like now? You're not going up the headland to look at the moon tonight, Great Uncle Mary said firmly. No, I didn't really mean that. I don't think I could manage it anyway. Simon stifled another yawn. I wonder whether the moon was full or not now. We should have to wait for ages if it were all thin and new. It's full tonight, Jane said. I could see it shining through my bedroom window, so that means it must be almost as bright tomorrow. Would that do, Gomery? I mean, could we go and look tomorrow night? Before the great uncle could answer, Simon was sitting up again, looking thoughtful. There's one thing wrong with all this. If we've got a moon that's only just past full, then we've got all the light we ought to have. But the moon changes, doesn't it? I mean, it rises and sets at different times and in different places, according to the time of the year. Well, we're in August now, but how do we know that the Cornishman wasn't working at his clues in the middle of January or April or something when the moon wouldn't look the same as it does to us? You're just being awkward, Barney said. No, said Great Uncle Mary, he's right, but I will say just one thing. I think you'll find it that this is the right time of the year. Call it luck, call it anything you like. But since you were able to follow the first clue, I think you'll find you're able to follow the rest. And yes, Jane, tomorrow night will do very well for looking at the moon and the standing stones. Especially well for a reason you don't know yet. Just after you came up, Miss Hatherton was asking your parents to go see her studio in Penzance tomorrow and to stay the night. Oh, will they go? Wait and see. Go to bed and try not to put all the faith in the moon. There may be greater problems still waiting for you than you think. Mother stood with her hand at the door of Miss Hatherton's small beetle-like car. Now, you're sure you'll be all right, she said doubtfully. Oh, Mother, of course we shall, Jane said. What could possibly happen to us? Well, I don't know. I'm not altogether happy about leaving you. What with that burglary? That was ages ago. So long as you don't set the place on fire, Father said cheerfully. Miss Hatherton had promised to take him shark fishing the next day, and he was as excited as a schoolboy. Don't let them go to bed too late, Uncle Mary, Mother said, getting into the car. Now don't worry, Ellen, Great Uncle Mary said paternally from the doorstep, looking like an Old Testament patriarch with the children clustering around him. I shan't have a chance to lead them astray with Mrs. Polk living in. We shall all probably die of overeating instead. Are you sure you won't all come too? Miss Hatherton leant across the steering wheel, blinking in the morning sun. The car lurched slightly as Father squeezed himself into the back. Simon handed in his fishing rods after him. No, honestly, thank you. It's no good. You can't tear these three away from Thurisic, Father said. I've never seen anything like it. Even trying to get them as far as the next village is like prizing a limpet off a lock. I daren't think what's going to happen when the time comes to go home. Well, they know their own minds. I can't tempt you away, Professor Lyon. Oh, dear, Mother said. I'm sorry you're stuck with them, Mary. She made a face at the children. Nonsense, Great Uncle Mary said. This is my element. Disgusting place, Penzance, anyway. He scowled horribly at Mrs. Hatherton. She grinned amiably back. Trippers, ice cream, little brass piskies. Commercialized. You can keep it. Well, Miss Hatherton said with a grin, starting the engine. Off to the piskies. We'll send you a stick of rock, Professor. Goodbye. Children. Excuse me. The car moved, a ragged chorus of farewell following it.
Goodbye, Mrs. Polk shrilled, appearing suddenly behind them on the doorstep and waving a tea cloth. The little car chugged up the hill and out of sight. Well now, isn't it that nice, the two of them going off together? Mrs. Polk said sentimentally. Quite like old times, I'll be bound, before their troubles began. She wagged her tea-cloth at the children. Do you mean us? Demanded Barney indignantly. That I do, proper headache you be. Still you'll do as I dare say. She vanished, beaming back to the kitchen. Jolly useful, that Miss Hatherton, Simon said with satisfaction. Of course, I hope they have a lovely time and all that, but it does leave the coast clear, doesn't it? That moonlight shadow, Jade said thoughtfully. You know, I've been thinking... No thinking today, Great Uncle Mary said firmly. We can't do anything until tonight. I haven't been in the sea since I came down here this year, and I think you should all take me down for a bathe. For a bathe? Vardy's voice rose in amazement. My apologies, I'm tripping up because I'm reading a little too fast, so forgive me. That's right. Great Uncle Mary glared down at him through bristly white eyebrows. Do you think I'm too old to swim, is that it? No, not at all, Gummery, Barney said, confused. I just never thought of you in the water, that's all. But what about the map? Jane wailed. We've just got going, Simon said reproachfully. Well, we shan't stop. We'll spend a nice quiet day on the beach in the sunshine. Great Uncle Mary grinned at them, and who knows? Perhaps there will be a moon tonight. And there, through the windows of the gray house, the moon hung in the late August evening when they were back from their day at washing before Mrs. Polk called them down to supper. The sun had flamed down to the beach all day, and they were all tanned. Barney's fair skin was burning an angry red, but now the moon dominated the sky, a sky deepening after the sunset to a strange gray-black, with all but the brightest stars dimmed by the milky, luminous sheen that flowed over sky and sea without seeming to come from the moon at all. Simon said, low and excited, It's a perfect night. Jane said. She had been outside to look at the sky and to study nervously the black outline of Kamar Head rising dark and impenetrable behind the house. One of my favorite words, impenetrable. Like Simon, she was excited, but the old uneasiness was back as well. It would be better, she told herself severely, not to think about the dark, or at least think of it as the same dark in which the old, long-ago Cornishmen worked out the clues that they were following now. But perhaps in this darkness, too, they still lurked the evil which had been creeping up on them from the unfriendly east, threatening the Grail as he sought urgently for a hiding place. Perhaps it was waiting for them out there. Why was there no light burning on the Withers' yacht? Oh, stop it, Jade said aloud. What? Sighed Simon in surprise. Nothing. I was talking to myself. Oh, good. There's the bell. Come on. Mrs. Polk, in the intervals of carrying heaped plates from the kitchen and empty ones back out again, was in a very firm, motherly mood. Great Uncle Mary told her that they were going night fishing out on the outer harbor, and at once she began laying great plans for filling their thermos flask with hot coffee and leaving plates of sandwiches ready in the kitchen for their return. But she would not hear of Barney going too. You am not going anywhere with somebody like that, my dear. 'Twould be sensible now. You stay here with me and have a nice early evening. That'd be the best thing by far. If you go out, you'll be rubbing and blistering quick as anything, and you'd be finding yourself in bed tomorrow when you'd be out in the sunshine, and you wouldn't like that, would you? It should be perfectly all right, Barney said half-heartedly. Mrs. Polk had painted calamine on his sunburned legs, but they were very sore and tender, and although he tried to hide the pain, he winced every time he took a step. He was very sleepy after the day spent running and swimming in the open air. Great Uncle Mary said, I think it would be best, Barney, if you awake, we'll come and report to you when we get here. That he won't, Mrs. Polk said. She treated Great Uncle Mary, for all her respect for the professor, with exactly the same indulgent strictness that she did Barney, Simon, and Jane. He'd have a good long sleep undisturbed till morning, then he'll wake up fresh as a daisy with all that soreness gone, and he can eat all about everything then. Mrs. Polk, Great Uncle Mary said meekly, you're a good soul, and you remind me overwhelmingly of my old nanny, who would never let me go outside the door without taking my galoshes.
Well, young Barnabas, I think...
Oh, all right, Barney said sadly. I suppose so. I'll stay here. That's right, Mrs. Poppy. I'll go and make you a nice hot drink before bed. She bustled out of the room. You lucky things, Barney said enviously to Simon and Jane. I bet you find all sorts of marvelous clues just because I can't come. It isn't fair.
As a matter of fact, you'll have the most important job of all tonight, Simon said impressively, and the more dangerous, too. We decided it'd be too risky to take the map with us, so you'll be in charge of it. Here. You might have to guard it with your life, suppose the burglars come back again.
Oh, don't, Jane said in alarm.
That isn't very likely. Don't worry, Great Uncle Mary said, getting to his feet, but it's a responsibility all the same, Barney. So you aren't altogether out of things.
Barney was not so sure whether to feel important or pathetic, but he went obediently to bed. Looking back as they set off into the dark, they saw his face pressed white against one of the upstairs windows and a dim hand waving them goodbye. Gosh, it's cold, Jane said, shivering slightly as they went up the road away from the village.
You'll be all right once we've been walking for a bit, Great Uncle Mary said.
He had insisted before they went out that they should wear sweaters and scarves under their coats, and they were grateful now. Everything seems terribly big, Simon said suddenly. They all spoke softly by instinct, for there was no sound in the dark night but the soft tread of their own feet. Only occasionally they heard a car humming past in the village, and very faint the wash of the sea and the creak of boats at their moorings and the harbor below. Jane looked round at the silver roofs and the patches of black shadow cast by the moon. I know what you mean. You can only see one edge of everything. There's always one side in shadow, so they can't see where it ends. And the headland looks awfully sinister. I'm glad I'm not on my own. This was a confession she would never have made in daylight, but somehow in the dark night it seemed less shameful. Simon said unexpectedly, So am I. Great Uncle Mary said nothing. He walked along beside them in silence, very tall, brooding, his face lost in the shadows. With very long stride, he seemed to merge into the night as he belonged to the mystery and the silence and the small, nameless sounds. Round the corner of the road, away from the harbor, they turned off and climbed over a fence onto the headland. The road curved round inland again, and above them stretched the dark grassy sweep of the slope, and on towards the standing stones, and in a little while they found the footpath and began the low to and from climb to the top. Listen, Jane said suddenly, stopping in mid-stride. There was no sound as they stood there, but only the sigh of the sea. You're hearing things, Simon said nervously. No, I'm sure. Above their heads, from the top of the headland, still out of sight, there came drifting down a faint, ghostly call. Oh, Jane said in relief. Only an owl. Horrible. I couldn't think of what it was. Great Uncle Mary stood still, nothing. They began to climb again. Then all at once they hesitated as if by some unspoken agreement. A dark curtain seemed to come down all around them. What is it? Clouds come over the moon. Look, it's only a little one. Like a puff of smoke, the cloud drifted away from the face of the moon as it suddenly had come, and the land and sea were silver again. You said there wouldn't be any cloud. Well, there isn't much. Only a few little ones.
The wind has changed,
Grand Uncle Mary said. His voice, out of his long silence, sounded very deep.
It comes from the southwest. Cornwall's wind. It brings clouds sometimes, and sometimes other things.
He went up on the hillside, and they did not like to ask him what he meant. As they climbed after him, more clouds came up, ragged and silver-edged in the moonlight, scudding swiftly across the sky as if another wind were up there, stronger and more purposeful than the gentle breeze blowing down into their faces over the slope. And then looming over the dark brow of the headland, they saw the outline of the standing stones, magnified by the darkness. They towered mysteriously against the silver-washed sky and vanished unnervingly into shadow whenever a cloud rushed over the face of the moon. In the daylight, the stones had seemed tall, but now they were immense, dominating the headland, and all the dim moonlit valleys that stretched inland from the lights of the village, twinkling faintly below. Jane clutched at Simon's arm, suddenly overawed. I'm sure they don't want us here, she said unhappily. Who don't?
Simon demanded bravado, making his voice louder than he intended. Shh, don't make such a noise. Oh, grow up, Simon said roughly. He did not feel happy in the empty darkness of the night, but he was determined not to think about it. Then he felt a coldness in the pit of his stomach as his great-uncle Mary's deep voice came back to them in a way that seemed to confirm all that Jane felt. They don't mind, Great-uncle Mary said softly. If anything, we're welcome here. Simon shook himself slightly, pretending not to have heard. He looked round at the stones surrounding them, rearing up against the sky. This was the one. He crossed to the stone they had found the day before. I remember this funny sort of hole in the side. Jane joined him, calmed by his matter-of-fact tone. Yes, that's it. When we looked across from here, we were absolutely aligned with the sun and that rock we started from, over on that other headland. Funny you can't see it now. I'd have thought the moon would shine on it like the sun did. The moon's in another direction, out over the sea, Simon said. Look at the shadow. Come on, that's what we've got to follow. Oh, bother, Jane said as another cloud crossed the sky and the moon, and they were left in the dark again. The clouds are getting much thicker. I wish they'd go away. Seems to me much more wind up here, too. She clutched her duffel coat round her and tucked her scarf in more tightly. Don't be long, Great-uncle Mary said suddenly out of the darkness. He was standing against another of the stones, swallowed up in its outline, as they could not even make out his shape. Jane felt a shiver of alarm return. Why? Is anything wrong? No. Look, here's the moon again. Excuse me. The night became silver again. Looking up, it was as if they saw the moon sailing through the clouds instead of on the other way around, racing smoothly across the sky, passing puffs and wisps of cloud on either side, and yet never moving from its place. Simon said in flat, dull disappointment, It doesn't point in anything. He stared at the ground, past the towering stone. Dark on the silver gloom on the grass lay the shadow cast by the high bright moon, and it pointed like a blunt finger away from Kamar Head towards the long dark inland horizon of the Cornish moors. Perhaps it points to some landmark we haven't noticed, Jane said, doubtfully gazing in vain over the shadow-masked hills. More likely the Cornishmen used a landmark that's fallen down or been destroyed or just crumbled away. There's always been that risk, and it would mean we'd never get any further than this. But he wouldn't have done that. I know he wouldn't. Jane looked wildly around her in the night, and the wind gusting over the bleak headland, and then suddenly she stood still and stared. From her place beside the great stone that was there, only sure mark, she had turned her head to the moon and raced motionless. High above the top of Kamar Head over the sea, and she saw, as if for the first time, the pathway of light that it laid down. Straight as an arrow, the long white road of the moon's reflection stretched towards them across the surface of the sea. Like a path from the past and a path to the future, as its edges danced and glimmered as the waves rose beneath the wind, and where it ended at the tip of Kamar Head, a clear dark silhouette stood against the shining sea-carried light. She said to Simon huskily, "Look." He turned to see, and she knew that in a moment he was as certain as she was that this was what they were supposed to find. "If there was rocks on the end of the headland," she said, "outlined there, it must be. And we weren't supposed to use the shadow as a pointer this time. We have to stand here by this stone and let the moonlight itself show us the clue." "That's what it does." Simon's voice rose as the familiar excitement of the chase came flooding back. "And if that's what he meant by the signs that wane but do not die, and the grail must be hidden somewhere in the clump of rocks, buried on the end of Kamar Head. Gosh, Gummery, we found it!" He turned back towards the silent, dominating circle of the standing stones, and then hesitated. "Gummery?" he said uncertainly. Jane came quickly to stand close to him. Out of the shelter of the rock, the wind blew her ponytail round across her face. She called out more loudly, "Gummery? Where are you?" There was no answer but the rise and fall of the sighing wind, loud enough now to drown the distant murmur of the sea. Jane, feeling very small indeed under the ghostly group of great stones, took hold of Simon's sleeve. Her voice quavered in spite of herself. "Oh, Simon, where's he gone?" Simon called into the growing wind. "Great-uncle Mary! Great-uncle Mary, where are you?" But still there was nothing but the darkness, and the high wind White moon sailing, now dark, now light, and the noise of the wind. They heard the husking wail of the owl again, nearer this time, over the headland in the opposite valley, a friendless, inhuman, desolate sound. Jane forgot everything but the loneliness of the dark. She stood speechless with fright, as if she knew a great wave were bearing down on her, and she could not move out of its path. If she had not been there, Simon would have been as paralyzed by fright himself, but he took a deep breath and clutched his fist. "He was over there before," he said, swallowing. "Come on." He moved in the direction of the other standing stone, barely visible now in the blackness. "Oh no!" Jane's voice rose hysterically. She clutched at his sleeve. "Don't go near them!" Another owl hooted unexpectedly on their other side towards the end of the headland. "Oh," said Jane miserably. "I want to go home." "Come on," Simon said. "He must be over there. I expect he can't hear us. The wind's getting up like anything." He took Jane's hand, and unwillingly she moved with him towards the dark, looming shapes of the standing stones. The moon dimmed and disappeared into the depths of a bigger cloud, so that only a dim, luminous glow from the stars gave shape to anything at all. They went gingerly through the darkness, feeling that any moment they might collide with something unseen, panic suppressed only by the desperate hope of finding their great uncle suddenly at their side. He seemed a very strong and necessary refuge now that he was not here. They were right among the standing stones now, and they could feel rather than see the black rock pillars rearing around them. The wind blew gustily, singing through the grass, and again they heard the owl cry below them out of the dark. They moved slowly together, straining their eyes to peer ahead. Then the ragged cloud turned silver again, and the moon came sailing out through the flying wisps at its edge. And in the same moment they became aware of a tall, dark shape looming up before them where no stone had been before. It seemed to swell as the wind blew, so that suddenly they saw it was no stone but the tall figure of a man, all in black, with a long cloak that swirled in the wind as he turned, towering over them. For an instant the moonlight caught his face. As he turned, they saw eyes shadowed under dark, jutting brows, and the flash of white teeth in what was not a smile. Jane screamed, terrified, and hid her face in Simon's shoulder. And then at once the moon was covered again by cloud, and the threat and roar of the darkness seemed to rear up all around them. Without a word they swung round and ran, stumbling, driven by panic, away from the silent standing stones and down the hill, until with an enormous flooding of relief they heard the call of a familiar deep voice. And as they looked ahead, gasping, they saw Great Uncle Mary silhouetted against the lighter background of the sea, standing before them on the path. They rushed to them, and Jane flung her arms round his waist and clung to him, sobbing with relief. Simon had just enough self-possession left to stand on his own. "Oh, Gummery," he said breathlessly, "we couldn't find you anywhere." "We must go down from here quickly," his great uncle said low and urgently, holding Jane to him and stroking the back of her quivering head. "I was looking for you. I knew there was something in those cries that was not like an any owl. Come quickly." He bent down and picked Jane up in his arms in one swift movement, as if she had been a baby, and when Simon close at his heels, he strode off down the hill, keeping to the path that they could just see as moonlight flashed through the racing clouds. Simon said, panting as he trotted along, "There was a man up there. We saw him, all of a sudden out of the dark. He was all muffled up in a big coat like a cloak, all in black. It was horrible." "I went to find them," Great Uncle Mary said. "He must have got past me. Then there were others. I shouldn't have left you alone." Jane, shaken in his arms as he loped down the hill, opened her eyes and looked back over his shoulder at the top of the headland, where the dark fingers of the standing stones still pointed up into the sky. And in the moment they disappeared over the horizon, she saw that there was twice as many shapes as there had been before, with other black figures standing among the stones. "Gummery, they're coming after us!" "They dare not follow while I am here," Great Uncle Mary said calmly, and went down the slope as they same long, easy stride. Jane swallowed. "I think I'm all right now," she said in a small voice. "Can you put me down?" Hardly pausing, Great Uncle Mary set her on her feet again, and like Simon still half ran beside him to keep up. They reached the bottom of the slope and crossed the field to the road, feeling as in a reassuring place after the vast, bleak emptiness of the headland. The wind no longer whined round their ears down here, and they heard again the friendly, soft murmur of the sea. "That man," Simon said. "That man, we saw him. It was him, Gummery, the one we'd never seen before. It was the man you rescued me from, the man who chased me with that boy." Jane said in a small, frightened voice, looking straight ahead of her at the twinkling village lights as she walked.
but I recognized him straight away when the moonlight shone on his face. That's why I was so scared. It was the Vicar of Thruisic. He's the man who saw my outline of the map in the guidebook.
And that is where we will end for today. The plot thickens. That's why I love this story. There's so much mystery and suspense and intrigue. It's very cool. It's very awesome. Which, pausing for a second, actually, I'll make a post about it. As always, I'll see you all next time. I love you all very, very much. Thank you so much for joining me.